Sometimes transformation doesn't come with fireworks, it comes with silence. A woman may wake up one day and notice that things no longer bother her the same way. People she once chased suddenly feel far away, not out of bitterness, but because her spirit has climbed a different mountain. This is not arrogance, it is alignment. This is not isolation, it is integration. When a woman enters her divine season, she becomes less reactive, more discerning, less talk, more truth, less fear, more faith. Not in external circumstances, but in the deep knowing that something is shifting within. At first, it may confuse others. They will say she's changed. And they're right, but not because she added something. She removed what was never hers. She is not becoming more. She is becoming real. This quiet revolution, this shedding of false roles and unhealed patterns, is the sacred path only she can walk. It cannot be rushed, and it cannot be explained to those who still speak the language of survival, while she is now fluent in peace. So I invite you to sit with this truth. The season of becoming is not loud, it is precise. And when you honor it, everything around you must either rise to meet you or fall away. Let us now explore this path, not with force, but with presence. Welcome to self-mastery, your space for real wisdom and inner growth. Subscribe and remember our name, self-mastery, because others may copy the voice, but the truth lives here. Let us begin. There is a particular moment in a woman's life when the noise begins to fade, and she no longer feels the urgency to prove herself, explain herself, or even defend her choices. She finds herself sitting in a room, perhaps alone, perhaps surrounded by others, but there is a deep and unshakable quiet rising within her. And this silence isn't empty. It's full of answers that were always waiting underneath the surface, beneath the constant striving and the voices of comparison. This is not the kind of stillness that is imposed from outside, like when life slows down because of external circumstances. It is the kind that arises from within because she has finally stopped resisting her own evolution. At this stage, many women begin to experience something unfamiliar: peace without permission. There is no longer the need for validation, applause, or attention. Even the desire to be seen is different. It no longer stems from lack, but from presence, from completeness. This is the first sign that something divine is unfolding. The paradox of this divine season is that the transformation starts so subtly, many don't even realize it's happening. But she feels it, a shift in energy, a deeper breath, a longer pause before responding, a softer heart that doesn't harden in the presence of misunderstanding. Her words become fewer, but more potent. Her movements less frantic, more deliberate. She walks slower, not because she is tired, but because she is no longer in a race. She understands now. There is no race, only rhythm. Science supports this quiet revolution. Studies in neuroscience show that regular periods of inner stillness, such as through mindfulness, breath work, or solitude, reduce the activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for emotional reactivity and fear. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex, which governs reason, planning, and emotional regulation, becomes more active. What does this mean practically? It means that a woman who embraces stillness actually becomes stronger. She's not just being calm. Her brain is literally rewiring itself for better choices, deeper clarity, and more powerful self-regulation. And this is where many people get it wrong. They think stillness is weakness. They assume silence means defeat. But in truth, it is the beginning of mastery, emotional mastery, relational mastery, and ultimately spiritual mastery. Stillness becomes the ground where a woman begins to see clearly, especially in her relationships. She starts noticing patterns that once seemed invisible. She recognizes the difference between connection and attachment, between attention and respect, Between love and control, she sees where she used to respond out of habit, out of fear, out of loneliness. And with this awareness, she begins to make new choices. Not louder choices, but wiser ones. Take the story of Elena, a woman in her mid-50s who had spent most of her life accommodating others. Her identity was shaped around being needed by her children, her partner, even her co-workers. She didn't know who she was without the demands of others defining her worth. But one day, after a particularly overwhelming emotional episode, she simply sat still. She turned off the noise. No music, no phone, no distractions, just silence. At first, it was unbearable. The silence confronted her with her own emptiness. But gradually, she began to feel something different, spaciousness. She began to see that her constant need to fix everything around her was not compassion. It was compulsion, a way to distract herself from fixing what was broken within. In that silence, Elena began to reclaim herself. From that day forward, she changed. Not dramatically, but steadily. She didn't explain her new boundaries to everyone. She didn't try to convince people of her worth. She just stopped abandoning herself. And in doing so, the relationships that could not respect her silence slowly faded. The ones that could meet her there deepened. This is the hallmark of the divine season. The outside world may look like it's falling apart. But inside, a woman is coming home to herself. Stillness, however, is not the end of the journey. It is the gate. Once this gate is crossed, another transformation begins. The emotional gravity shifts. Where she once sought love, she now radiates it. Where she once tried to please, she now chooses alignment. This is not about becoming cold or detached. Quite the opposite. She becomes more loving, but less needy. More generous, but less sacrificing. She no longer pours herself out until she is empty. She offers from a place of fullness. This change is profound, especially in her relationships. It might first appear as distance. She's not texting as often. She's not always available. She no longer says yes out of guilt or fear. But if you look closer, you'll see it's not distance, it's depth. She is no longer reacting from emotional survival. She is responding from emotional sovereignty. From a psychological perspective, this shift is tied to what is known as internal validation. When a person, especially a woman who has been socially conditioned to prioritize others, begins to derive her sense of worth from her inner truth rather than external approval, everything changes. Her nervous system settles. Her anxiety reduces. Her decision-making becomes clearer. She stops over-apologizing. She stops shrinking. And because she no longer needs to be liked by everyone, she becomes infinitely more authentic, more magnetic. This is not just theory. It plays out every day. Consider the example of Amina, a woman in her early 40s, who had spent years trying to gain the affection of a partner who gave her breadcrumbs of attention, but never the consistency of commitment. For years, she justified his emotional distance, telling herself he was just busy or not expressive. But during her divine season, something shifted. She didn't suddenly stop loving him. She just started loving herself more. And with that, her energy changed. She stopped initiating every conversation. She stopped twisting herself to be easier or less demanding. She began investing her emotional energy into herself, into journaling, walking, meditating, and reconnecting with old hobbies. Within weeks, the dynamic changed. The man noticed. His texts became more frequent, his tone more respectful. But Amina saw through it now. It wasn't love, just the discomfort of losing control. And for the first time, she didn't react. She responded with silence, not out of spite, but out of peace. Her peace had become more valuable than his approval. This is what it means to move from seeking to radiating. People can feel the difference in your presence. You are no longer looking for someone to complete you. Because you are no longer fragmented. You carry yourself differently, not with arrogance, but with knowing. You speak differently, not to impress, but to express. You love differently, not to be chosen, but because love itself has become your nature, not your currency. This kind of energy cannot be faked. It is cultivated. It comes through stillness, through reflection, through choosing solitude over shallow companionship, through turning inward, not to escape, but to understand, to recalibrate. In Eastern traditions, this process is often called the return to the true self. Not the self that was shaped by pain, pressure, or performance, but the self that existed before the world told her who she should be. And once she begins to live from this place, people sense it. Some will be drawn closer. They'll be curious about her peace. They want to know how she holds herself with such softness and strength. But others will pull away, not because she did anything wrong, but because they are not ready for the version of her that no longer entertains dysfunction. And this is important in her divine season. A woman must learn to let go with grace. Not everything lost is a failure. Sometimes what falls away is simply out of resonance with who she is becoming. She no longer begs for space in places that dim her light. She no longer explains her silence to those who only understand noise. This inner transformation is both subtle and powerful. It may not be visible in material achievements right away, but internally, the architecture of her life is being rebuilt. From scarcity to sufficiency, from fear to faith, from noise to knowing. Each morning, she rises not just to meet the world, but to meet herself. To ask, what is true for me today? What do I need to stay rooted? What must I release to remain aligned? She no longer carries the entire emotional weight of her relationships. She allows others to take responsibility for their part. She stops micromanaging love. She stops performing for acceptance. And slowly, she becomes her own sanctuary. This isn't the loud, performative confidence that the world often celebrates. It's a quieter kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to convince anyone, the kind that can walk away without slamming the door, the kind that can say, this is not for me, without bitterness, just clarity, and that clarity is priceless. It allows her to rest not just physically, but emotionally. She doesn't rehearse imaginary conversations in her mind anymore. She doesn't carry unspoken disappointments. She speaks truth with tenderness. She listens without absorbing everything. She loves without losing herself. This is not the result of luck or privilege. It is the result of inner work, of choosing healing over hiding, of choosing growth over guilt, of choosing presence over performance. And so, as she continues to evolve, her relationships evolve with her. Not always immediately, not always easily, but inevitably. Because energy never lies, and the energy of a woman who has entered her divine season is unmistakable. It is calm yet commanding, soft yet unshakable, quiet yet deeply heard. The world begins to respond differently, not because the world changed, but because she did. Because her center is no longer external. It lives within, and everything in her life now orbits around that center. Not in chaos, but in harmony. And that is where the next evolution begins. There comes a time when a woman realizes that her body is no longer something separate from her spirit. It is not just a shell to decorate, to criticize, or to push past. It is a sacred vessel, a reflection of her consciousness. During her divine season, this understanding deepens. The body becomes more than a physical form. It becomes a mirror. Every choice she makes, from the food she eats, to the way she breathes, to how she moves or rests, begins to shape her emotional and energetic state. She starts to understand that the body doesn't lie. While the mind can rationalize chaos and tolerate misalignment, the body quietly stores every unresolved feeling, every suppression, every betrayal of self, and eventually it speaks. What most people don't realize is that long before the body breaks down, it whispers. The tension in her shoulders, the fatigue that doesn't go away, the restless sleep, the digestive issues. These are not random, they are signals. And when a woman enters her divine season, she no longer dismisses these messages. She listens. She understands that healing is not just emotional or spiritual. It is cellular. There is a kind of reverence that arises in this stage. She no longer eats carelessly because she knows that food is information, not just fuel. It tells the body what to build, what to repair, what to destroy. She no longer pushes herself to exhaustion in the name of productivity because she knows that rest is not laziness, it is restoration. She no longer forces herself into environments that drain her because she knows that her nervous system is sacred and protecting it is wisdom, not weakness. Scientific research confirms this intuitive wisdom. When women practice somatic awareness, connecting with their body through breath, movement, or stillness, they activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs rest, digestion, and healing. This allows the body to shift out of survival mode. Cortisol levels drop. Inflammation reduces. Hormonal balance begins to return. She feels more grounded, more alive, more herself. Not because she added more to her life, but because she removed what was harming her silently. In this season, even her posture changes. She no longer shrinks herself to be less visible, nor stiffens to protect herself from being hurt. Her spine straightens, but her shoulders soften. She walks as though she belongs, because she finally feels that she does, in her own body, in her own life. There's a story of a woman named Liana who spent most of her youth disconnected from her body. As a child, she had been praised for her academic excellence and obedience, but no one taught her how to feel. Emotions were something to suppress, not explore. Her body became something she ignored unless it failed her. Years of ignoring discomfort turned into chronic fatigue, anxiety, and emotional numbness. One day, after collapsing from exhaustion in the middle of a meeting, she was forced to stop. She took a sabbatical, not just from work, but from the persona she had built. And in that quiet space, she began to ask questions she had never asked. What does my body need? What does it remember? What have I been carrying that was never mine? She started practicing gentle yoga, not for weight loss, not for aesthetics, but to feel. She cried in poses that released deep tension. She changed the way she ate, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. She walked barefoot on the earth, not because it was a trend, but because it made her feel connected again. Slowly, she began to understand her divine season was not about chasing a goal, it was about returning to wholeness. As her body healed, so did her relationships. She began setting boundaries, not just with people, but with her own habits. She stopped overextending. She stopped consuming content that made her feel less. Then, she stopped engaging in conversations that drained her. Her relationships became cleaner. Less drama, more depth. Less performance, more presence. This inner shift brought her to another powerful realization, that every time she said yes to something that dishonored her body, she was saying no to herself. And every time she honored her body, she was telling her spirit, I trust you. That level of integrity began to rewire her self-worth, not just as a concept, but as a lived experience. This is the quiet power of embodiment. It's not about having the perfect routine or becoming a wellness expert. It's about living in a way that respects your rhythm. It's about knowing when to push and when to pause, when to speak and when to breathe. It's about remembering that your body holds every chapter of your story and that healing is not forgetting, but integrating. As this reverence deepens, something else begins to emerge. a woman starts to notice the sacredness of her choices. Not just what she puts into her body, but what she allows into her life. And this brings us into another essential transformation. Her yes becomes sacred. There is a profound shift when a woman no longer says yes from fear, guilt, or the desire to be liked. She no longer offers her time, her energy, or her body as a currency for connection. She understands now that every yes is a seed, and if she's not careful, she will grow gardens of obligation instead of fields of alignment. At this stage, the quality of her relationships undergoes a transformation. She no longer engages with people just because of history or obligation. She no longer entertains conversations that leave her feeling smaller. She doesn't say yes to events, relationships, or responsibilities that pull her away from her center. Not because she's closed off, but because she's finally open to herself. This is where many people begin to misunderstand her. They may say she's changed, that she's become difficult or distant. But what they're really noticing is her clarity. And for those who once benefited from her confusion, her clarity will feel like rejection. But it's not. It's just truth. Her truth. This kind of boundary setting is not loud. It doesn't come with drama or long explanations. It is subtle, clean, and firm. A quiet no, a graceful exit, a delayed reply, an inner decision that no longer needs external approval. And this isn't about becoming selfish. It's about becoming aligned. Behavioral science supports this clarity. When a person begins to live from internal values, rather than social pressure or emotional reactivity, they experience less decision fatigue, less resentment, and more fulfillment. Boundaries become not barriers, but bridges to a more authentic, sustainable life. Take the example of Marisol, a mother of 3 and a community volunteer who always said yes. Yes to every school event. Yes to every favor. Yes to every emotional dumping session from friends. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor. Until one day, her daughter asked, "Why are you always too tired to play with me?" That question pierced through every justification she had. She realized she had become so available to the world that she was unavailable to herself and to the people who truly mattered. From that day, she began to choose differently. She started small, one no at a time. She stopped picking up the phone during dinner. She delegated tasks. She let go of friendships that were built on obligation, not reciprocity. And though the transition was uncomfortable, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the peace that comes from everything going right, but the peace that comes from finally doing what is right for you. This is the power of sacred decision making. A woman learns that her time is a non-renewable resource, that her energy is currency, that her presence is a gift, not a given. And once she starts living this way, her life becomes more intentional, less cluttered, more aligned. She no longer runs herself, ragged trying to be everything to everyone. She becomes everything to herself, and from that place, she offers what is true. In relationships, this changes the dynamic completely. She stops chasing connection. She stops explaining her worth. She no longer fears being misunderstood because she understands herself. And in understanding herself, she naturally attracts those who understand her too, or are willing to try. And even when misunderstandings arise, she no longer pleads to be seen. She knows that being unseen by the wrong people is not a loss. It's a redirection. A reminder that not everyone deserves access to her sacred yes. This kind of emotional discipline doesn't come from pride. It comes from practice, from the daily habit of checking in with herself. Is this choice aligned with my peace? Is this invitation in harmony with my values? Is this relationship supporting or depleting my growth? And if the answer is no, she releases without guilt, because she knows that every yes she gives from fear is a betrayal. and every no she gives from clarity is a blessing. As this clarity deepens, her life begins to organize itself differently. What no longer fits begins to dissolve. What is meant to stay finds its place, and in the quiet between her choices, something beautiful begins to grow. Trust, not in others, but in herself. And this trust becomes her compass. It becomes her guide. She doesn't need to see the whole path to take the next step. She just needs to stay true, because she understands now her divine season is not about saying yes to everything. It's about saying yes to what matters. And in doing so, everything else begins to align. When a woman begins to awaken to herself, truly awaken, there is one inevitable truth she cannot ignore. The people she keeps closest to her are mirrors. Not always mirrors of who she is now, but often reflections of what she once believed about herself, about love, about her worth. The divine season doesn't just bring change within, it reveals what must change without. And in relationships, this revelation can be both liberating and painful. A woman begins to see the ways in which she has accepted less. Not because she was weak, but because she was unaware. She starts to recognize that what she once tolerated was not because she lacked strength, but because she hadn't yet remembered her value. This realization doesn't come with blame. It comes with awareness, deep, unshakable awareness. And with that awareness, she can no longer pretend that the unhealthy patterns are love, that chaos is passion, or that inconsistency is mysterious. Her divine season calls for truth, not fantasy. It requires her to look at every connection and ask, is this nourishing me, or is it draining me? Is this relationship growing with me, or is it holding me in a version of myself I've outgrown? One of the hardest shifts in a woman's life is when she begins to outgrow the dynamics she once thought she needed. When she sees the partner who never listened as a reflection of a childhood wound, not as a soulmate. When she realizes the friend who always needed saving is a remnant of the part of her that needed to feel needed. When she starts to recognize that the emotional roller coaster she used to confuse with love was really just emotional unavailability dressed in excitement. That clarity doesn't come from bitterness, it comes from healing. And healing always changes what you're willing to entertain. There's a certain level of internal peace that no longer permits you to sit in chaos for the sake of company. From a psychological lens, this is explained by something called trauma bonding, the tendency to feel attached to dynamics that mirror early emotional wounds. If love in childhood felt inconsistent or conditional or tied to performance, it's not uncommon for adults to find themselves repeatedly drawn to people who feel familiar in their unpredictability. But when a woman heals, when she begins to witness her patterns with compassion and wisdom, she disrupts that cycle. She stops chasing what hurts. She stops mistaking familiarity for safety. And in doing so, she starts to choose differently. Take the story of Anaya, a woman in her late 30s who spent nearly a decade in a relationship with someone who made her question her worth daily. He wasn't cruel in obvious ways. He was subtle, dismissive, emotionally unavailable. He rarely criticized her directly, but he constantly withdrew affection as a form of control. He never raised his voice, but he made her feel invisible when she needed him most. For years, Anaya told herself that she was too sensitive, that she just needed to try harder. That love required patience and endurance. But deep inside, something was breaking. It wasn't until she began working on herself, through reading, journaling, and spending time alone, that she started to feel the tension between who she was and who she was pretending to be in the relationship. She realized she was editing herself constantly, walking on emotional eggshells to avoid his disapproval. One day, after a particularly numbing conversation where he dismissed her feelings for the 100th time, she sat in silence. Not to be silent, but to listen. And in that stillness, the truth emerged. She was not being loved, she was being tolerated. And that was no longer enough. Anea ended the relationship, not in rage, but in reverence. Reverence for the version of her that stayed, even when she was hurting. Reverence for the lessons, and reverence for the new version of herself who finally believed she was worthy of more. That's what happens when a woman begins to heal. Her standards change, not because she becomes demanding, but because she becomes aware. She understands that love is not supposed to feel like emotional starvation. It is not supposed to make her doubt her value. Real love is not painful in its essence. It is kind, it is clear, it is stable, and more than anything, it supports growth. As she enters her divine season, she stops waiting for others to validate her experience. She becomes her own confirmation. She no longer needs a long list of offenses to justify her departure. One violation of her peace is enough. She no longer entertains disrespect just because someone claims to love her. She knows now, love is not just a word, it's a behavior. It's an energy. It's how someone shows up when it's inconvenient. It's how they handle your vulnerability, how they respond to your needs. And when those patterns are absent, no amount of potential can make up for what is missing. She begins to trust how she feels in someone's presence. The nervous system never lies. If she's constantly anxious, second-guessing, trying to decode mixed signals, she doesn't try to fix it anymore. She honors it. She asks, what part of me believes this is acceptable? What belief is this dynamic reflecting back to me? And then she works on that part, not to keep the person, but to release the pattern. Relationships, in this light, become teachers. Every connection either reinforces her growth or reveals what still needs healing. And she stops taking things so personally. If someone cannot meet her in depth, it's not a confirmation of her inadequacy. It's a reflection of their limitations. If someone withdraws when she sets a boundary, it's not a sign she's too much. It's proof they were never willing to rise. This discernment gives her peace. She no longer tries to make people stay. She knows that anything forced isn't real. She doesn't chase closure. She knows that clarity is often found in someone's silence. She doesn't need long explanations. She reads energy. She watches behavior. She believes patterns, and she acts accordingly. This doesn't mean she stops loving. On the contrary, she loves more deeply than ever, but she does so without losing herself. She gives, but not to be needed. She listens, but not at the cost of her own voice. She supports, but not to the point of depletion. She loves with open hands, not clenched fists. And this is the shift from attachment to connection. In attachment, there is fear. Fear of loss, fear of abandonment, fear of being alone. But in connection, there is presence, mutuality, respect. When a woman heals, she starts choosing connection over attachment. She stops investing in one-sided relationships. She becomes more curious about how someone makes her feel than about how much attention they give. And she no longer confuses consistency with compatibility. There's a quote that says, "You don't attract what you want, you attract what you are." This becomes clear in her divine season, when she was in survival mode, needing to be loved, chosen, approved of. She often attracted people who mirrored that urgency, that scarcity. But as she becomes whole, as she embodies peace and alignment, she attracts differently. She begins to notice people who see her, not as a role to be filled, but as a soul to be respected. This doesn't mean everyone will be ready for her. In fact, some people will find her peace intimidating. They'll misinterpret her boundaries as rejection, her silence as arrogance, her clarity as confrontation. But she doesn't take that on. She understands now, everyone is meeting her from their own level of consciousness. and not everyone is meant to walk with her through every season. This is not a loss. It's a refinement. The woman in her divine season becomes comfortable with solitude, not as punishment, but as sanctuary. She would rather sit alone in peace than be surrounded in pretense. She chooses depth over distraction, quality over quantity. She no longer craves constant attention. She craves authentic connection, and she's willing to wait for it, not passively, but intentionally. This changes how she dates, how she speaks, how she listens. She asks different questions, not just, "What do you do?" but, "How do you love? How do you respond when you're triggered? What does accountability mean to you?" She's not impressed by charisma anymore. She's interested in character, and not surface-level charm, but real, embodied integrity. And in friendships, the shift is just as profound. She no longer maintains connections that thrive on gossip, complaining, or emotional dumping. She surrounds herself with people who are emotionally responsible, people who can celebrate her without envy, people who can sit in silence with her without discomfort, people who are doing their own work and therefore don't depend on her to regulate their emotions. This doesn't mean she cuts everyone off. It means she becomes selective. Her energy becomes intentional. Her space becomes sacred. And when she loves now, it's not from a place of needing to be filled. It's from a place of overflow. She doesn't lose herself in love. She finds deeper expressions of herself through love, but only when the space is safe, only when the connection is mutual, only when the energy is reciprocal. She knows now that love doesn't fix wounds, it reveals them. And she welcomes that because she no longer fears her pain. She's faced it, she's held it, and in doing so, she has become a woman who can love without conditions, but not without standards. And so she walks through her relationships not with entitlement, but with elegance. She doesn't demand loyalty. She inspires it. She doesn't beg to be understood. She expresses herself with clarity and leaves the rest. She doesn't measure her worth by who stays or who leaves. She measures it by how true she remains to herself, regardless of what others do. Her divine season teaches her that relationships are not rewards for being perfect. They are reflections of her evolution. And as she evolves, so too must the energy around her. Not by force, but by frequency. Not by demand, but by discernment. And in this place, love begins to take a new shape. Not as a possession, not as a destination, but as a way of being. As something she lives, breathes, and extends. Not because she lacks it, but because she has become it. There comes a moment in a woman's life when she no longer seeks attention, but attention begins to find her. Not because she is louder, not because she has become more visible in an external sense, but because her inner energy has become unmistakably present. She walks into a room and shifts its atmosphere without uttering a word. This is not magic. It is not manipulation. It is the quiet, authentic power of alignment. When a woman enters her divine season, her magnetism no longer originates from the surface. It is not about physical appearance, fashionable expression, or social charisma. Her power becomes elemental. It begins to move from the core of who she is. And what radiates from her is not force, it is frequency. A frequency of calm, of clarity, of confidence that doesn't need confirmation. This is the beginning of sacred magnetism, and it cannot be faked. There's a deep difference between performing confidence and embodying it. In one case, a woman is exhausted, constantly maintaining an image that isn't rooted in truth. In the other, she is energized, because she is not trying to be anything. She is simply being herself. The more aligned she becomes with her truth, the less effort she needs to expend to attract what belongs to her. This is why emotional exhaustion is one of the early signs that a woman is not living from her true essence. In relationships, This magnetic shift is profound. A woman in her divine season doesn't chase, manipulate, or give to prove her worth. Her presence is the message. She has learned that energy cannot lie. She no longer relies on words to convince someone of her value. She doesn't try to hold together relationships that aren't rooted in mutual respect, because she understands that misaligned connections only delay her divine timing. A woman who honors her season has refined her energetic field. It is no longer scattered. She's not everywhere, trying to be everything for everyone. Her focus is sharp. Her intentions are clear, and her boundaries are clean. This clarity creates emotional coherence within her, and people can feel it. They may not understand it intellectually, but something about her makes them pause, breathe slower, feel safer, or even become more aware of their own noise. This is the mystery of spiritual magnetism. It has roots in neuroscience too. When someone is emotionally regulated, calm, present, and self-aware, their nervous system becomes a model of coherence. The heart rate becomes more stable. Breathing slows down. The vagus nerve, which plays a central role in emotional equilibrium, becomes more activated, creating a sense of safety and trust not only within the person, but around them. This creates what researchers call limbic resonance, a phenomenon where the emotional state of one person harmonizes or influences the emotional state of others through non-verbal cues. You see this in a mother calming a child. You feel it when you're around someone deeply grounded. Their stillness makes you feel safe to let go. Now imagine this effect in a romantic relationship. A woman in her divine season does not try to be impressive. She becomes impactful by her very state of being. Her emotional stability becomes a mirror for others. Her groundedness becomes attractive. Not in the typical romantic sense, but in the way a calm harbor attracts a ship lost at sea. There's a story of a woman who worked in a chaotic corporate environment. High pressure, constant deadlines, and interpersonal tension. She didn't try to dominate conversations or compete for recognition. Instead, she brought presence to every room she entered. She listened deeply, responded mindfully, and remained centered, even when others were reactive. Over time, colleagues began seeking her input, not just because of her skills, but because her presence brought a sense of clarity and calm. Promotions followed, not because she asked, but because her value became undeniable. She didn't perform power. She embodied it. And that's the lesson. True magnetism is not about external volume. It's about internal resonance. This applies powerfully to romantic relationships. A woman in her divine season no longer pursues partners based on urgency or fear of being alone. She doesn't entertain inconsistent energy or settle for half-hearted attention. Why? Because her energy is not in survival mode anymore. It's in creation mode. She has healed enough to stop projecting her wounds onto others. She doesn't need to be completed. She is not chasing potential. She is moving with intention. This energy shift redefines attraction. It filters out emotional immaturity without a single word. Immature love requires performance. Divine love requires presence. And presence can only arise when a person is no longer fragmented within. Sometimes people ask, why do men pull away when I become more confident? The answer is simple. Not everyone is ready to stand beside someone who is no longer energetically needy. When you stop depending on external validation to feel whole, you naturally raise the bar. And not everyone is willing or able to meet it. This is where your silence becomes powerful, because you no longer argue to be understood. You no longer plead to be loved. You no longer debate your worth. Your energy carries the message. And if someone cannot hear it, it is not your job to raise your voice. It is their journey to raise their awareness. A woman who has entered her divine season is not afraid to let go. She knows that what is meant for her will not require begging. What is aligned with her will recognize her, not just her beauty or her skills, but the quality of her spirit. She becomes magnetic to opportunities, people, and experiences that vibrate at her new frequency. There's a quote that says, "You attract what you are, not what you want." This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. When a woman constantly finds herself in draining relationships, it is often because her energy is still open to that frequency. She may have not yet learned how to sit with herself, how to meet her own emotional needs, or how to identify love from neediness. Once she does, her patterns begin to shift. The moment she says, "I will no longer sacrifice my peace to be chosen," the universe begins to rearrange itself. But this choice must be embodied, not spoken. Words are easy. Energy does not lie. There's another story about a woman who was tired of dating cycles that led to heartbreak. She decided to stop dating for a while, but not from bitterness, from clarity. She used the time to travel inward. She joined a meditation circle. She began journaling every day, not to vent, but to observe. She practiced breathwork to regulate her emotions. She began noticing how her body reacted when she was around different people. She started to trust those signals. Months passed. She re-entered the world. She looked the same on the outside, but inside she was unrecognizable. Men she would have entertained before no longer held any appeal. She no longer explained her boundaries. She simply lived them. The emotional clutter was gone, and with that, her true energy emerged. This is the transformation that magnetism requires. A clearing. You cannot attract what you are unwilling to prepare for. If your life is filled with anxiety, unresolved trauma, and emotional over-attachment, then even the right person may be repelled, not because they don't see your value, but because your energy signals chaos, and chaos cannot sustain love, only harmony can. This is why emotional self-mastery is not just a spiritual idea, it's a relational foundation. A magnetic woman does not use her energy to control outcomes. She uses it to align with truth. She no longer stays in places where she has to beg to be heard. She no longer dims her light so others can shine. And most importantly, she no longer betrays herself just to feel temporarily needed. Her energy says, "I see you, but I also see myself. I choose connection, but I do not fear separation. I am open, but I am not exposed. I am love, but I am not a lifeline." This depth is rare, and that's why she becomes rare. People often ask, how can I develop that kind of presence? The answer is not in a single practice. It's in a pattern of presence. Begin by slowing down, not just externally, but internally. Ask yourself throughout the day, am I here? Or am I reacting to something in my past? Am I centered? Or am I performing for someone's approval? Am I honoring my energy? Or am I leaking it for crumbs of attention? This level of honesty is the beginning of energetic refinement. Magnetism is not an act. It is a byproduct of alignment. A woman who walks with emotional clarity becomes unforgettable, not because of how she looks, but because of how she makes others feel. And she makes others feel safe, seen, or inspired. Not through effort, but through essence. When you stop speaking to be heard and start listening to your own inner silence, everything changes. Not immediately, but inevitably, because nothing is more attractive than a woman who is no longer afraid of her own stillness. She has seen herself. She has held herself through storms. She has stopped asking others to rescue her. She has rescued herself. And now, her energy doesn't scream for validation. It whispers truth, and those who are ready for her will hear it. When a woman enters her divine season, something profound begins to unfold. Not just around her, but within her. The transformation is not always loud. It may not announce itself through dramatic changes or public victories. It often begins in silence, In the stillness of early mornings, in the moments when she chooses peace over proving a point, when she walks away without bitterness, when she chooses herself without explanation. In this season, she doesn't need validation to know her worth. Her energy no longer chases love. It radiates it. Her boundaries are no longer walls built from pain, but gates guarded by wisdom. She understands that what's meant for her doesn't require her to shrink, suffer, or settle. She begins to magnetize experiences, people, and opportunities that honor her presence, not because she's seeking them, but because she's become aligned with them. Her emotional reactions grow quieter, more discerning. Where she once used to feel the urge to fight to be understood, she now smiles and lets misunderstanding pass. Her power no longer comes from how loud she speaks, but from how deeply she listens. She is no longer ruled by what others expect her to be, but instead guided by who she was born to become. That shift from external demand to internal alignment is the essence of her divine season. This is not a time of escape from difficulty, but a time when she faces challenges with a new kind of grace. She knows when to rest and when to rise, when to speak and when to be silent, when to give and when to walk away. Her strength is not found in defiance, but in discipline, emotional, mental, and spiritual. She no longer lets her emotions run wild like untrained horses. She holds the reins, not to suppress, but to direct them wisely. In her divine season, her relationships change, not because people suddenly become different, but because she no longer entertains what drains her. She stops begging for bare minimums and starts expecting wholeness. She understands that love is not pain wrapped in pretty words. It is presence, peace, protection, and purpose. And if it doesn't feed her soul, it's no longer allowed to sit at her table. She becomes deeply rooted in awareness, aware of her habits, her patterns, her triggers, and her dreams. She begins to recognize that the way others treat her is often a reflection of how she's been treating herself. So she stops waiting for apologies and starts offering herself healing. She stops romanticizing potential and starts honoring reality. She no longer confuses longing with loyalty. This divine season reintroduces her to herself, not the version others preferred, but the version she buried beneath people, pleasing, perfectionism, and performance. She remembers her voice, her rhythm, her intuition. She begins to trust her own silence more than the noise of the world. She no longer tries to fix others as a way of proving her worth. She simply chooses to be whole, and that wholeness becomes a light for those willing to rise, not an anchor for those refusing to grow. And perhaps the most sacred part of this season is that she no longer seeks to be saved. She realizes that her healing doesn't come from another's arrival, but from her own awakening. She doesn't need someone to rescue her. She needs space to rise. And rise she does, with intention, with clarity, with quiet confidence. Not to impress, but to embody. In this divine season, she no longer looks for signs outside of herself. She understands that her peace is the sign. Her alignment is the confirmation. Her joy, her rest, her tears, all sacred signals that she is in tune with something far greater than what the eyes can see. She no longer apologizes for outgrowing spaces, people, and versions of herself that no longer fit. She blesses them and releases them with love, because now she understands endings are not punishments. They are preparations. Every closed door redirects her towards something richer, deeper, truer. She doesn't rush. She flows. She doesn't chase. She attracts. She doesn't force. She allows. This is her sacred unfolding. This is her divine season. And everything, absolutely everything, starts to change.